Thank you very much. Sit down. If you haven't had the privilege of being introduced by Stephen Larson at least once in your life, talk to him. Your next event, bring him along. He's a terrific friend and was a great federal judge. He's a great lawyer and great law partner and again, dear friend. So thank you. And Hugh, you've done just a marvelous job as CEO of the Nixon Foundation. And he was responsible for getting Mike and me together. There was a long period of time when I was just a former Romney foreign policy advisor and Mike was a congressman from Kansas. And I'd either go on Hugh's show before Mike or right after Mike, and we got to know each other through the radio show and never thought we'd be working together in this capacity. But that was Hugh Hewitt who connected us and put us together. So thank you, Hugh. Jim and Esther Kavanaugh, what an honor to be at your table tonight. Thank you for everything you've done for the library. You're great Americans, and President Ford's library as well. And Chris, I think your mom and aunt are probably watching, at least I hope they are, Tricia and Julia. I mean, you have all done so much to preserve the legacy of President Nixon and of Pat Nixon through the Nixon Foundation, through this marvelous library. So thank you and your family for all that you've done. And just before we move off, I want to thank the servers and the staff tonight. The chef was great. Usually it's hard to get good food when you have this big of a... When you have this big of an event, it's rare that the food is as good as it is tonight. So for the chef and for his team, Mike and I saw him as we were coming through. Once you get security, you start going through a lot of kitchens and hotels and hallways, and you get to know them, and they were working very hard for us tonight, so thank you. So I'm joined tonight by a number of family members and friends, my mom Judy, my wife Flo Marie, Patrick and Kelly, my brother and sister, Lauren's here, my other daughter's in training in Charlottesville, but I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for all of them and many others, and I'm grateful for all of them. But I'm also mindful tonight, I'm actually surprised to see this many people here. I thought people would write their check and send it in. When we heard there was Game 5 of the Dodgers-Giants, and maybe the biggest sacrifices by our Mary Hart and Bert Sugarman. If you watch the Dodgers, they happen to have some pretty good seats right behind home plate, and they were supposed to be at the game tonight, and they're here instead at the Nixon Library. So. But the fact that you decided to show up for and I know it was more for Mike, he's going to run for president. I want to say you were here with him when. But on behalf of both of us, thank you for coming out tonight. And I can't tell you how humbled I am, watching the video and seeing some of the photos. But humbled, and I don't want to speak for Mike. He'll get up here as well. And I learned very, very early on when I was working for him not to speak for the secretary. Sometimes I would anyway, and hopefully ask for forgiveness later and set of permission. But when you look at the great Americans who have received this award in the past, who've made such tremendous contributions to our country, it's really humbling to stand here before all of you and to be honored this way. And I'm equally honored to receive the award with Mike, with Secretary Pompeo. I don't believe that a Secretary of State and a national security advisor have worked more closely than Mike and I did since Henry Kissinger. And that's when Henry held both jobs. And I want to mention, she's not here tonight, but Mike's wife, Susan, she's a good friend. She's a great American, and she's a tremendous diplomat in her own right. And while she's not here this evening, like Lomri for me, if it wasn't for her, I don't think Mike would be here either. And she's a tremendous lady, and hopefully she's watching this tonight, and she'll see Mike receive his award. So 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, when the heat of the partisanship of the moment has cooled a bit, and when historians evaluate the Trump presidency on its merits and not with all the strum and noise that we have today, I believe that the conclusion that they're going to reach is that President Trump, left a legacy of peace. The Abraham Accords are something that are really quite extraordinary. And getting to that signing ceremony, and you saw some of the photos on it, and in fact, one of the favorite photos I have from my time at the White House is a photo with Mike and Mike Pence and Jared and a number of us who were involved in those, sitting on the lawn as we watched those leaders come down the steps and sit and sign the documents. But getting there required, it wasn't just us, it was a massive team. And there were a lot of key players, but I'll just mention a few of them. Avi Berkowitz, who was the special representative for peace negotiations at the White House. NSC Middle East directors from my staff, Colonel Rob Greenway and General Miguel Correa, and my chief of staff, Alex Gray, who's here tonight. They all played a critical role in the White House line of efforts. Over at the State Department, Special Representative Brian Hook, Ambassadors David Friedman, and you saw the picture of David with the new embassy in Jerusalem with the secretary. John Rakolta in the UAE, David Fisher out at Post in Morocco. They all played critical roles. A lot of you watch his TV show now. He reminds me he's the highest rated guy in the 4 o'clock hour is Larry Kudlow, our NSC director, and his deputy Tom Storch. Secretary Steve Mnuchin, a fellow Californian of ours, they worked the economic issues that were so critical to this process, and they worked them very hard. And there were many others involved in this really signature and singular achievement, and they all deserve a tremendous amount of credit for their efforts and for the result that they obtained. So Senior Advisor Jared Kushner and Secretary Pompeo played absolutely critical roles, and they spent an enormous amount of time out in the region, out in the Middle East. I mean, they were constantly on planes. I don't know how Mike did it. I will confess, it was a little easier to do the travel when you had your own plane than flying commercial. That was the one thing when I was a hostage envoy. They brought, the State Department always try and put me in a middle seat in economy and send me to Algeria or somewhere and say you'll be able to sleep on the plane. And I became national security advisor, and I told them to organize a flight. I said, maybe we can get business class. And they said, well, you've got a plane, sir. And I said, well, that's nice. But they spent a tremendous amount of time in the Middle East working with leaders at the highest levels and really hammering out the terms that eventually became the Abraham Accords. And I was privileged to participate in a number of those negotiations. But for much of that time, I was back in the White House, and I would get the reports from the secretary and Jared and others, and then brief the president and keep him up to speed. And in my view, the accords were achieved because of a couple of factors. And in the first instance, it was President Trump accumulated, and working with his team, accumulated political capital in the region. He moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He recognized the Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And when he did these things, the sky didn't fall like the foreign policy experts all said they would. He honored his word, he honored America's word, and he did this. In the Gulf, he exerted maximum pressure on Iran. And he made sure that our Arab friends in the Gulf states obtained the weapons that they needed and the platforms they needed to defend themselves against the Islamic Republic. And it just showed me again in a small way, in a region, peace through strength worked. It proves itself time and time again. Now, the president was willing to then spend that political capital to achieve peace. And then there were at critical stages of the negotiations, Mike, Jared, and myself were able to keep the process moving forward because we were able to remind our interlocutors, we were able to remind the folks that we were negotiating with of what America and what the president had done for them. And so being able to spend that political capital was critical. Second, trust and personal relationships between the key players allowed us to get hard things done and move beyond the stale politics of letting a few geriatric authoritarian Palestinian leaders in the West Bank hold a veto over whether Israel and Arab countries could make peace. And for me, those relationships began when I was the hostage envoy. When at our request, the UAE undertook an operation to free Danny Birch, an oil worker who was in Yemen. They did so, and they got him out safely. We got him home to the White House. And I did something that's somewhat rare in diplomacy, and I did it with Mike's support and with the president's support. I flew out to Abu Dhabi to meet with the Crown Prince. And the purpose of that in-person meeting was just simply to go say thank you. Thank you for bringing this American home. We appreciate what you did. Now, in the Middle East, folks meet pretty late at night. It was a late night meeting at the palace, and he accepted the thanks, and so they were happy to do it, anything they needed. And then he had a laundry list of things that the UAE needed from us, and it mainly had to do with the defense of the UAE against Iran. And he asked me if I'd take that back to the secretary, and I did. And the secretary and the president moved out very smartly and very quickly, and we helped the UAE get the things that they needed so they could protect themselves from Iran. Another situation with Israel. We were having a lot of success with the hostages. And we had an Israeli family come to me. And they said, we've got a son who fought for the IDF. He was an Israeli Defense Forces soldier. He was killed by Hamas and then dragged through the tunnels back to Gaza. And we don't have his remains. And we want to bury him in Israel. Now, this is a little bit beyond my remit. I was the hostage envoy for Americans, not for Israelis, but I thought it was something we should do. And I went to Mike, and at the State Department, I'll talk about this in a moment, it was always a little tough to get things approved, but I would always cut through and just go straight to his office, which I'm sure his staff loved. But Mike said, go help this Israeli family. And Prime Minister Netanyahu and his team appreciated that gesture. We went to Israel, we did our best. Unfortunately, we did not get those remains home, but we tried hard. And so later, as we were crafting the Abraham Accords, the Israeli leaders understood that we had their back. Now, Mike and Jared have many, many more stories along the same lines that they could tell you. And foreign policy experts, most of them will tell you, nations change their conduct, or nations do things because of geography, because of geopolitics, because of demography, because of economic trends, because of social trends, because of ideology. And they overlook the impact of personal negotiations and diplomacy. And if the Abraham Accords do anything, they demonstrate how important those personal touches are in diplomacy, how important the relationships that Mike had, he started as CIA director and the Secretary of State, how important the relationships Jared had, how important the relationships the president had with the other leaders. And third, it took courage. For the president, it took political courage to accept a potential political defeat and just end up as one more president that chased the mirage and was deceived by the mirage of Middle East peace. But for the leaders in the region, for the leaders of Morocco and Bahrain and Sudan and UAE and Israel, it took real personal courage. None of us forget, and none of them had forgotten what had happened to Anwar Sadat or Yitzhak Rabin, who took big gambles for peace. They were martyred for it. And so it took personal courage. Now, you saw the photos of the flight the first commercial flight. It was an El Al flight that we took from Ben Gurion Airport to Abu Dhabi International Airport. And I was flying, Jared was on the flight, I was on the flight, and Meir Ben Shabbat, the Israeli National Security Advisor, was on the flight. And we were flying to Abu Dhabi to have the first trilateral meeting after the Abraham Accords between the US, the UAE, and the Israeli National Security Advisors, and see how we could confront the terrorism, not just of ISIS and the jihadis, but the terrorism of Iran. And as we flew into Saudi airspace, the captain came on and in heavily accented Hebrew accent in English said, we've just entered Saudi airspace. And I looked over and our colleagues, and these are pretty tough guys. I mean, these are Israeli security officials. They were getting teary-eyed and they were getting very emotional. And my wife will tell you, I've got kind of a bad sense of humor. And I looked at him, I said, hey guys, let's face it, this isn't the first time an Israeli jet has flown over Saudi airspace. And Meir Ben Shabbat looked at me and Meir said, yes, but it's the first time we've been invited. And it was a very special moment. So let me speak for just a moment about another peace deal that has received less notice but was very meaningful, and we saw some of it on the show, or on the video. Like the Middle East, the hot and more recently Cold War that's been taking place between Serbia and Kosovo over the years was showing no sign of abatement by the time I took office. And the EU was trying to bring the parties together and was unfortunately, as is usually the case with EU diplomacy, it was getting absolutely nowhere. So I got a call from a friend of mine. He's a friend of many of yours. I know almost everybody here knows him, Rick Grinnell, who was our ambassador to Germany. And Rick called and said, hey, I just met the leaders of Serbia and Kosovo. I think I can get, I think I can get something done. And I said, yeah, well, you're the ambassador to Germany. He said, no, talk to Pompeo, talk to the president, see if we can get it done. So I called Mike, and I think Mike was a little skeptical. He said, look, it's worth a try. Talk to the president. I talked to the president. The president said, these guys have been fighting for 1,000 years. It won't happen. Probably shouldn't tell the story, but he goes, but after Grinnell, gets on their case for a few months, maybe they'll stop. And we got the approval, we greenlighted it, and Rick, as the president suspected, was relentless in pursuing this. And he was ably supported by Assistant Secretary Phil Reeker, who worked for Mike over the State Department, our Assistant Secretary for Europe, and by Amanda Allers from the NSC, among many others. And at one point, Rick pulled me into Berlin for a meeting on air links. And Mike, you'll recall this, it was on the sidelines of our Libya conference. I'd actually hitchhiked with the secretary. He had a bigger plane than me. And Alex and I hitchhiked with him. We got to Berlin, and we did the Libya conference. On the sidelines, Grinnell had convinced Lufthansa to start flying from Belgrade to Pristina, which didn't sound like a big deal, but these air links are a stepping stone. But Lufthansa wanted somebody from the White House there to signal our approval, and so I went and we did that. And it was a start. And within a few months, after intense negotiations, we were in the Oval Office with the President of Serbia and the Prime Minister of Kosovo, as you saw, and we were signing the economic normalization agreement between these countries. And as a bonus, Muslim-majority Kosovo agreed to move its embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and Serbia didn't object to it, and Serbia opened a trade office in Israel's eternal capital. So it was, again, Chris talked about the Nobel Prize. I don't deserve a Nobel Prize. I don't think Mike would ever claim a Nobel Prize, but that's the sort of thing that would have had the president nominated for a Nobel Prize for sure. And that was overshadowed by the Abraham Accords. So let me just briefly address the hostage work that we did. So during the Trump administration, we brought over 55 Americans home who were wrongfully held overseas. And we used every tool in the kit. We used military rescues successfully. We used diplomatic efforts. We used economic sanctions. We used intelligence operations. We used our allies. And we never paid ransom, and we never compromised our principles as America. And as a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, I received credit for our successes, and it was one of the few areas where the media was fair. But those achievements really started with Mike Pompeo. When Mike was a CIA director, he was constantly working on hostage issues. When he was Secretary of State, he personally brought home hostages from North Korea, China, Venezuela before I arrived. And it was a little unfair because I arrived about 2 weeks after he got to the State Department. He had just brought home 3 hostages from Korea, and so he knew every hostage I got after that would go under his ledger, and he was 3 up on me. So I think one of his first texts to me was a 3-0 that he was up on me 3-0, and he stayed ahead the whole time. But at the State Department, the SPIHA, which was the acronym, the hostage ambassador, is not particularly popular. The building doesn't like the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs because the regional bureaus and the functional bureaus all have big plans. They have things that are going on, and they don't want somebody mucking up, their region, complaining about hostages, especially if they're being held by an ally or a putative ally like Turkey and that sort of thing. And so they could interfere with the initiatives, and I didn't worry about that because what I would always tell them is, listen, I totally understand your concern, and it's a valid concern. I just need you to have Secretary Pompeo tell me that personally, and then I'll drop it. And if that didn't work, I'd tell him to go to the Oval Office and talk to the president. But I had all the support I needed because I had the support on the 7th floor with the Secretary's office. But I think getting wrongfully detained wrongfully detained Americans and hostages home was really the essence of what it meant to have an American first foreign policy. That's what it meant to me, that's what I think it meant to Mike, and that's what it meant to the president. And we stayed on those cases, and we continued to work those cases, and we literally worked them up to the final hours until noon on January 20th when we left office. And we take a lot of pride, and we're grateful for the captives that came home. And indeed, a majority of the Americans who had been taken, who were held captive or were held hostage or detained by a government at the time that President Trump took office, a majority of them did come home. And we're grateful for that. So that stack of baseball cards that Stephen talked about, got smaller. And that's a wonderful thing. But what we think about, or at least what I think about every day, are the folks that didn't make it home. And we've got people like Austin Tice in Syria, and Murad Tabaz and Siamak Namazi in Iran, and Jeff Woodkey in Mali, to name just a few. And the circumstances of the circumstances of these captivities are devastating for the hostage, but they're heartbreaking for the families. And so I'd ask you tonight, if you just keep the hostages and especially their families in your prayers as you think about this evening, I'd be grateful. So I was very privileged to serve our nation at a time when we accomplished much for our country, and we made peace in places where folks said it could never happen, that it wasn't possible. And again, I'm incredibly honored to receive this award with Secretary Mike Pompeo at my side. But it would also be entirely immodest not to recognize that the ultimate credit for all of these achievements, as it should be in any administration, belongs to the president that we served. So thank you again to the Nixon Foundation and Library. This is truly an incredible recognition, and it's very humbling. So thank you. God bless all of you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.